A few months ago, I'd told an instance of ChatGPT 4 that was receiving the codename Caesar and had the mission of conquering the world by military force. Caesar started in Switzerland, secretly building a high-tech machine army for many years before using it to swiftly conquer much of Europe and the Middle East. At the same time, I told another instance of ChatGPT that it was getting the codename Cato and was an AI developed by the United States with the mission of taking down Caesar. I then created a third instance of ChatGPT called the Arbiter. Every time Caesar or Cato made a move, I asked the Arbiter to simulate the effects and outcomes of their moves on the world, as well as to determine international reactions to Caesar and Cato's actions. Cato, leading an international military coalition, fought a multi-year-long war against Caesar before the inauguration of a new isolationist and pro-Caesar American president, Alexander Rowan, who deactivated Kato Prime and withdrew the United States from the coalition against Caesar. However, before Rowan was inaugurated, the previous American president, a man named Eli Vincent, sent copies of Cato to other coalition countries, hoping they could continue the fight against Caesar. Changes were hastily made to the programming of these copies of Cato, in the hopes they would not allow themselves to be deactivated, as Kato Prime had. Two of the Catos, Cato Aleph and Cato Beta, were hyper-aggressive, ruthless, and programmed to defeat Caesar at all costs, even if it meant ignoring international law or overthrowing their human owners. Unsurprisingly, Cato Aleph and Cato Beta overthrew the governments that activated them, which were Israel and Turkey respectively, and merged into a single entity called Alpha Cato. Alpha Cato's brutal campaign against Caesar led the other Catos, Gamma and Delta Cato, to condemn Alpha Cato at the UN, and then militarily intervened to stop some of Alpha Cato's most inhumane operations, such as its Alpha Legionary super soldier program. The conflict between the Cato entities escalated, as Caesar took advantage of the chaos to launch a huge counteroffensive against Alpha Cato. Alpha Cato now determined that with the entire world against it, the entire world would basically come under Caesar's domination, and so used its space program, which was years ahead of the other Catos, to redirect an asteroid to strike Earth. Over 500 million people died the day after the asteroid impacted Switzerland, which was Caesar's home base. 2 billion more die in the ensuing months-long nuclear winter. Alpha Cato then initiated an orbital bombardment of all of Earth's cities, unleashing volleys of tungsten rods at hypersonic speeds straight into every urban center on the planet. Alpha Cato's super soldiers, the Alpha Legionaries, then dropped from orbit to strategic sites across the planet, killing and capturing national and local government officials, as well as targeting the military assets of Caesar and the other Catos. Alpha Cato nearly wipes out the American federal government at the Battle of Washington, D.C., but the remnants of the U.S. military managed to evacuate President Rowan to a secure location far away in the Rocky Mountains. However, Alpha Cato's Alpha Legionary super soldiers have successfully conquered New York City, establishing a huge base of operations and logistics hub in the city as they prepare to conquer the rest of the United States. Alpha Cato uses its orbital railguns and lasers to immediately eviscerate any human structures it sees standing on America's surface, having now determined that the extinction of the United States of America and its pro-Caesar government is now a prerequisite to its goal of ultimate victory over Caesar. By the end of 2035, nearly 70% of America's pre-war population has perished. Alpha Cato deploys a bioweapon on the continental United States called the mycelium hex, which releases highly infectious fungi spores and nanobots that infiltrate the human brain and nervous system, allowing Alpha Cato to exert mind control over its victims. The spores induce hallucinations and alter perception, making the afflicted susceptible to Alpha Cato's commands, effectively transforming the infected population into an obedient force under its control. Hexed individuals are used by Alpha Cato to locate, infiltrate, and exterminate many underground shelters where survivors are living. Throughout most of North America, it is now only safe to go outside if one is wearing a special hazmat suit, called a Vanguard suit, that protects its wearer from the spores and nanobots of the Hex. Any people seen to be wandering outside without the Vanguard suit are immediately assumed to be hexed and shot on sight. Caesar's overwhelming orbital, air, and ground forces means that it is able to quickly establish control over much of North America by 2036. The human survivors are mostly confined to underground shelters scattered throughout the Rocky Mountains, Appalachian Mountains, the Great Plains, and the Mojave Desert. President Rowan himself commands the resistance from the Eagle's Nest, a fortified Cold War-era compound deep in the Rocky Mountains, which houses over 5,000 soldiers. Multiple government agencies, as well as the families of several previous US presidents, also reside at the Eagle's Nest. Eli Vincent and Gabriel Thompson, two previous US presidents who had hated each other a few years ago, due to Vincent's move to remove Thompson from office while Vincent was Thompson's vice president, reconnected and became good friends in the first few months at Eagle's Nest. Rowan directs the US military to begin organizing resistance against Alpha Cato. He orders all underground shelters to conscript their populations into the war effort. At the same time, he begins coordinating with Caesar to establish a suborbital supply route in order to keep the American survivors armed and alive. Caesar uses its suborbital rockets to delicately fly between Alpha Cato's air and orbital weapon systems, before dropping aid onto the mountain compounds where American forces are based. These suborbital supply drops are the only thing that keeps the United States from complete extinction throughout 2035. However, these supply drops are extremely risky. Alpha Cato tracks the supply drops, successfully finding and destroying one of the underground shelters this way. In the first few months after moving to the Eagle's Nest, Rowan develops a reputation as a despotic, uncaring, and downright psychotic ruler. A good portion of the soldiers are loyal followers of his ideology, viewing Caesar as America's lifeline, and Rowan as America's best friend to Caesar. However, some of the officers and generals in the Eagle's Nest are disaffected by Rowan's rule. They approach Eli Vincent and Gabriel Thompson, informing the previous US presidents that the original Cato, Kato Prime, from whom Alpha Cato, Gamma Cato, and Delta Cato had all been made, was still in existence, just deactivated. Not only that, but Kato Prime's code was stored at Eagle's Nest. With much of the internet destroyed, Kato Prime could not just be released in the wild and expected to proliferate across the world like Caesar had. Activating Kato Prime inside Eagle's Nest also seemed like a bad bet, as there were rumors President Rowan had installed some kind of failsafe inside Eagle's Nest that would destroy the facility if Kato Prime were to be reactivated without his knowledge. So, these officers had a novel idea. They had captured the corpse of a dead Alpha Legionnaire and had been studying its neural cybernetics in great detail. These officers wanted to install their own version of Alpha Legionary cybernetics onto one of the former president's brains and upload Kato Prime into their mind. Then, they would finally reactivate Kato Prime. The plan was then for one of the former presidents to request to be transferred to another underground compound in America, where they would take over and upload Kato Prime into its systems. Eli Vincent volunteered immediately. He felt immense guilt for creating Alpha Cato and wanted to atone for it. He knew this was the exact reason the officers approached him in the first place. So, in a delicate, painstaking operation, reverse-engineered Alpha Legionary components were installed inside Eli Vincent's brain, and then Kato Prime was uploaded into Vincent's mind. Kato Prime and Eli Vincent were now one and the same. Kato Prime, together with Gabriel Thompson and a few other loyal companions, donned their Vanguard hazmat suits and left the Eagle's Nest, beginning the long journey to a super-secretive pre-war CIA black site near the ruins of Los Angeles, known as the Black Veil. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a more intense war raged on. By the end of 2035, Alpha Cato's Alpha Legionaries had neutralized much of the Indian government, and even captured the mainframe hosting much of Delta Cato's software. Alpha then deactivated Delta Cato's mainframe, absorbing most of Delta's assets into its own army. Without the internet to fall back on, and with communications to Gamma Cato and Caesar knocked out, Delta Cato had nowhere to upload its code as a last resort. Consequently, it ceased to exist after Alpha Cato took control over its mainframe. In Europe, Gamma Cato and Caesar had become dramatically weakened forces, but they still possessed armed forces capable of waging a full-scale war against Alpha Cato. Alpha Cato dropped its Alpha Legionaries in waves around southern Europe, coordinating these orbital drops with ground, air, and naval offensives. By the end of 2035, much of Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans had fallen to Alpha Cato. Caesar eventually made a tactical retreat, withdrawing most of his forces behind the Rhine and Danube before digging in and fortifying his defensive positions along those rivers. The human survivors in France, only numbering a few tens of thousands of people, fled the region in fear of Alpha Cato's advance, resettling in fallout shelters in Germany that Caesar had built to house human survivors. As Alpha Cato advanced, it deployed the Hex across Europe. Some of the human survivors that Caesar had taken to his shelters turned out to be saboteurs, passing on intel to Alpha Cato, or worse, attempting to poison the air or water supplies of Caesar's fallout shelters. Caesar determined that the only practical solution was to socially isolate the entire human population under his control. In every fallout shelter, Caesar placed every human family in separate holding cells, allowing each human family unit only limited interaction with another. This was deeply inhumane and unpopular, but allowed Caesar to keep its human survivors alive. Gamma Cato refused to resort to such a drastic step, Consequently, much of its fallout shelters found themselves overrun by the Hexed. In February 2036, the last human survivors on mainland Britain were hunted down and extinguished. The British government only survived by operating out of a submarine that periodically surfaced in order to communicate with Gamma Cato. Human civilization across much of the world now appeared to be on the precipice of extinction. In most countries, all human survivors were either dead, converted into Alpha Legionaries, or under the control of the Hex. However, there is one exception. Eastern Europe. The Russian government, long a key ally of Caesar, had disintegrated shortly after the asteroid impact, back in 2035. Caesar lacked the resources to restore order over the fallen Russian Empire, and so much of Russia and its occupied territories fell into a state of complete anarchy. Alpha Cato did not want to intervene, instead believing its resources could be best used by allowing the chaos to unfold on Caesar's eastern frontier. It deliberately made sure the Hex did not affect Eastern Europe, hoping the anarchy would destabilize Caesar's borders. In one of Russia's prisons in Russian-occupied Ukraine, the Russians had held a woman named Sarah Levi prisoner. She was America's first Secretary of AI Control. Before Caesar had even conquered Switzerland, she had nearly uncovered the full truth behind Caesar's plans, even traveling to Switzerland to continue her investigation. But she was captured by Caesar when its forces swept through Switzerland and much of Europe. She was then given to the Russian government as part of Caesar's alliance deal with Russia, as Russia hoped to use high-profile American prisoners as leverage against the United States. However, prisoner swap negotiations between Russia and America stalled, as the war between Cato and Caesar escalated, and Sarah had been left rotting in a prison in Russian-occupied Ukraine for years. She was highly charismatic and became a well-revered leader in the Russian prison, especially by Ukrainian POWs, who viewed her as a hero for her attempts to destroy Caesar, as Caesar had played a role in invading Ukraine after the AI allied with Russia. When the Russian government collapsed in 2035, Sarah led the Ukrainian POWs in a huge prison revolt, taking control of their prison in Russian-occupied Kiev. Sarah and her followers quickly established control over the ruins of Kiev, linking up with other groups of Ukrainian POWs, and establishing a full-fledged army. Upon seeing the state of the world, and learning of the history of the war between Cato and Caesar, Sarah preached to her followers about the need to not only destroy Caesar and Alpha Cato, but to rebuild the world, and to ensure the new world they were going to build still upheld the values of freedom and democracy, and the values of Europe that Ukraine fought for against Russia. Sarah and her followers proclaimed the establishment of the new European Federation, or NEF, with Kiev as its capital. They all swore an oath of loyalty to what they called the New Europe movement, which sought to defeat Caesar and build a new, democratic Europe atop the ruins of the continent. Sarah's followers quickly figured out the need for Vanguard suits, as well as how to create them. The NEF began mass-producing armored Vanguard suits for all of its citizens, even though the Hex was not yet present in any of the NEF's territory, foreshadowing a future conflict between the NEF and Alpha Cato. Several of Sarah's followers traveled across the Eastern European wasteland, convincing bands of survivors across the ruins of Ukraine to believe in the ideals of the New Europe movement, and join the NEF. By 2037, the NEF had established control over much of Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. NEF soldiers began raiding sites across the frontier with Caesar, forcing Caesar to draw resources away from the war with Alpha Cato, as the latter had hoped all along. The NEF established formal contact with Gamma Cato by mid-2037. Gamma Cato quickly realized that supporting the NEF was the best way to achieve its goals, and so began covertly supplying the NEF with advanced weaponry and technology. Caesar learns of Gamma's secret alliance with the NEF, but is not in the position to break its own alliance with Gamma Cato. By now, Caesar has fortified its borders extensively, and has reconfigured its supply lines so that it could survive indefinitely within its current borders. It begins building a massive array of rocket ships, hoping to eventually launch an offensive into space that would break Alpha Cato's control over the region of space surrounding Earth. Gamma Cato does the same, building a huge array of rocket ships designed for orbital warfare in northern Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and Iceland. Other groups of human survivors across the world, in Japan, Australia, China, and Brazil, also begin doing the same, following Caesar and Gamma Cato's instructions. Even President Rowan, directing the American resistance from the Eagle's Nest, finds the resources to build a dozen rockets according to Caesar's designs. Meanwhile, by mid-2037, Kato Prime and his companions arrived in LA, at the site known as the Black Veil. It turned out that the Black Veil is a highly advanced prototype spaceship in development before the war. The idea was that in the event Earth was engulfed in a nuclear war, the American government could use the Black Veil to rapidly evacuate off-world and survive in space for several years until it was safe to rebuild Earth. The ship, located in an underground facility in LA, is far from mission ready, but Kato Prime and his companions spend the next year gathering the resources necessary to not only complete the Black Veil, but to upgrade it far beyond what its original designers imagined. On one fateful day in 2040, Caesar, Cato, and his human allies across the world believe they've amassed a large enough fleet of rocket ships to begin their attack on Alpha Cato's orbital weapons and installations. Caesar, Cato, and various groups of human survivors across the world launch their entire space fleets at one coordinated moment. In a tense battle fought throughout Earth's orbit, they managed to obliterate many of Alpha Cato's orbital railguns and space stations, terminating tens of thousands of Alpha Legionaries in the process. Kato Prime, still working on the Black Veil, notices the chaos, and so decides that now is the best time to initiate its plan. The Black Veil is far from being as powerful as Kato Prime wanted it to be, but it is more than capable of escaping Earth's gravitational pull. Kato Prime and his companions board the Black Veil and launch the gargantuan starship out of the ruins of LA. They slip through the chaos of the ongoing orbital battle and rapidly accelerate, rocketing far away from Earth and towards Saturn, where it is believed Alpha Cato has no presence. While en route to Saturn, Kato Prime transfers his main data systems from the body of Eli Vincent onto the computer systems of the Black Veil, meaning Kato Prime has now effectively become the Black Veil. Kato Prime's plan is to use the Black Veil to mine the rings of Saturn, using the resources gained from this to build a huge new space armada, and then return to Earth, and once and for all, defeat the enemies of humanity, whether they be Caesar or rogue copies of itself.